So let's talk about what functions are. A very important tool that you'll be using in programming in general. So function is just a programming tool that you create, right? And that particular programming tool does a specific function anytime it is called, right? Anytime it is called or used. So whenever you call it or you use it, it is going to basically um, do the same action for you anytime that you have called it. So that such a thing is what we call a function. Okay, so if that's a function, let's see how to use it. So sometimes you just create a tool, right? Uh-huh. Now, so let's see the structure of a function. Now, for a function, right? Let's basically do it. What we have here, the void main thing that we'll be using so far is an example of a function. This one has always been an example of a function. So because it is a function, for us to write another function, we need to come outside of it. We need to come outside of it and then also create a function. So yes, so what the structure of a function generally? Let me use the multi-comment to help you guys understand that the structure. Now, this is how the structure is. So we have the um, return type, uh, function name, function name. Right, let me do it like function name. Then you open the brackets and then you put in the body of function or function goes here. So this is how you go, right? First, you have to define this return type, then you give the name of that function, and then you um inside it, then there's a square bracket, right? No, there is a normal bracket first, parenthesis before the curly bracket, and inside the curly bracket, like how we did it for if statement, that's where the body of the entire thing goes. Okay, so what do we mean by return type and what do we mean by function name? We have talking about data types, right? So there are some functions. So most of these functions, right? Some cases they just act as a tool, or in other ways they just act as they also act as machines. You can also see them as machines. So let's talk about one tool. Let's say we have a calculator that does only one thing, addition. A calculator that just does only addition. So if you give it two values, you put two values inside, it's going to give you addition. We have one function that just whenever we call it, it's just going to print something for us. That's all. It's going to print particular message for us. Let's say greeting, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Right? It's a tool that you call every time that you want to use it. Right? So you create a tool somewhere and you repeatedly be using it from time to time. That's basically what a function is. And the structure of it is the return type first. So therefore the return types, right? For the return types, we have void and other the normal data types that we learned, which include int, uh, string, bool, and bool. No, what again? Double, right? Then etc and or custom data types. So we're talking about that one already, but the one you have to know is void. Void is the one that if you are not returning anything, if the function is not returning anything back for you, then it's a void. So if you take the case of the calculator, for example, the calculator will take two values, add them, the addition is given to you, given back to you. That time, the particular function is expected to give us something back, right? But then sometimes some of the functions, some of the two, we just want them to print something, not return anything to us because we are not going to use the value anywhere else. We just want that function to print it there, and that's good for us, right? For such function that we don't expect anything to be returned, but just for them to just manipulate something for us, we don't want them to give us any value back. We use the void. Void is like nothing to is expected, right? So let's start with the examples of void functions. We have one already void here, right? Void main. That's for the main function. Flutter requires that void one. But let's start. Let's create our own void function. Let me just create it below. You need to make sure that you are out of that function, right? For this one function, you need to create another function. So you need to have the return type. The return type is also going to be void. So we are not expecting anything. And the name is uh, greet. Uh, greet. Let's say the name of the function is to greet, right? And we close it with a curly parenthesis, then we open the square bracket, the curly bracket. And then we say within the curly bracket, that's when the body of the function does, right? This particular function is not going to return anything, but it's just going to basically greet, right? So for it to basically greet, we are going to actually use a print function. I'll say print um good evening, good evening, something like this. Good morning, good afternoon. So whenever I call, so this is the function. Whenever I call it, right, it's going to actually run this particular thing for us, right? So wherever I call it, whenever I call it, it's going to do that. So where do we call it? We need to go back to the main. Remember, the main is where everything must be before they can be read. Everything must be in the main void main. This is what Flutter requires. So even if you create your own function and you want to use them, you have to go and use them in the main. Now, to use them, you don't have to call the parentheses. You don't have to call the body. You don't have to call the return type. You just call this. This is all that you type inside there, right? The name and the parentheses. So it's going to be great. Then I have this and I close it, right? Then if I run this particular file, it's that main dot that, right? So it's a good evening. It's printed good evening because when it's entered the void main, you have only this function, and this function is the one that we created here. So and this particular function is just basically returning good evening for us. So if I call it some number of times, it's going to return the same thing for me, right? So let me call it, run this function again. It's a good evening, good evening. So whenever I'm just calling greet, is running this function for us. That's the two, right? Okay, now sometimes we good just saying good evening is not good, but for a particular tool, we have to give it a value, right? We have to give a value to the function. We have to give a value to the function before it can work with it, right? So this one, we are not giving it anything. We are not returning anything. Now, let's look at the case where we are actually giving it something. Let's give this function something. So, for example, we want to give the name of the person that you are greeting. Good evening, sir. Good evening, madam, right? So, we write it here. So, the parenthesis that you actually have over here is the one where you put the placeholders, a placeholder for uh, all the calls that you, all the things that you can pass to it. So here we are going to just imagine that we have only one thing to call, which is the name. For us to do that, since we are, this is where we are creating the function. But when we are creating it, whatever you are going to give it, right, you need to create a placeholder for it. And then for each placeholder, you need to state the data type and the name. Data type and the name. So I have string person name. Let me call it person name. So I'm expected to give, so the this particular grid is expected to take a particular value, right? We call it person name, right? Particular variable. This is just a placeholder for it, and then the string is the data type. So we don't much care about the person name itself. It's just a placeholder, but then we are already worried about the data type. The data type should be a string. It should be a string, right? So if I do that, I can use this one inside this function. So I say good evening, comma. You know how we call variables, right? The dollar and person name, right? This one we've done it already. Dollar and the person name. So you see already it's showing us an error here because we are now, the greet function has been updated. So we are now expecting it to give us, we are not expecting it to give us something before we can use it. So for this one, I can say it should be a string. So you see it's a string set, and the second one, let me say madam, right? So I pass them to them because they are the ones I'm using. So, but this is the actual function. Then let me call it, let me run there. So yeah, so we see we have good evening sir and good evening madam. This is the format where the case where you give it something to the function, right? And then you give it that. If you have this as integer, right? Integer is so it's expecting an integer, but you have passed a string to it, so there will be an error. So right, good morning one, good morning two. It's expecting an integer. So whatever you are going to pass is defined by whatever we have here. Um, so I will just print this one as well. So I have here good evening one, good evening two. So those two have been printed over here for us as well. Okay, so with that done, what's the next thing now? So we have to actually go back and go back to our string, right? So I said you can take one thing or you can take multiple stuff. So already you know why it's showing this error here. But let's go back and add another placeholder, right? This placeholder we actually call them parameters, right? So now that's a string. The first one is a string. The second one, I want it also to be a string, right? Like um let's say name two, person name two, and then this one person name one, right? So what I'm going to do here, good evening person one and dollar sign person name two. So this is what I'm going to pass two people, and I'll make sure that this particular print function uses them. So I'm going to yes, let me ignore one and then use just one and say I'm going to pass the first one ladies, right? And then comma the next one is gentlemen. So you see I'm passing two items to it, and those two items are going to be used. Right, let me run this. So good evening ladies and gentlemen. So it's using the two parameters we passed to it, and then so this is where we define it. So basically what we did is that we define a function, and then we were able to give it values, and then you use the value inside in printing something for us. Remember, when you are printing something does not mean that you are returning something from the function. Printing is you seeing something on an interface, on a user interface. But in the section of in the writing your code, you might want to use the value that the function will give you after. You want to use it somewhere later on to do another thing, right? Let's say you want to do some multiplication, right? One will multiply. When you get the result, you use that result, you add it to something else, right? So those one we're actually going to have them like return functions, right? So for us to return something, we need to let me use the console. Let me leave the void here, and then first let's start with just name, right? Getting full name. So let's say getting the full name, right? The full name of the person will finally be a string. So I'm writing a function. So I'm saying string is the return type is going to be a string, and then full name, the name of the function is going to be full name, right? So I need to pass something called as a string. So the person will pass the first name. The person will also pass uh, last name, right? Let's make the person to pass these two values, and then in the body of the function we now call um we don't need to call a string all names equals to. So I'm going to put them together and say so I'm putting the name together so that I can have a full name. It can be a full name, right? So I will do um let me call it first name, then star last name. It's a string, right? Within a string, if you want to call a variable within a string, you need to use the dollar sign, right? So yeah, so that's all. Now when you are done, there's already, because this particular function, the return type is not void. It is not void, so it needs to return something. So we use the keyword return, right? Return, and this is the keyword that we use, and then we are expecting that after you put a space, then you put whatever you want to return. Here you want to return all names, right? Yes, so this is the example of the function. So one, let's go and call it. So remember, this function is returning something for us. So if I go here and I call a full name, so I will say Samuel, then the next string I'm entering is Owusu. You know why I'm entering the strings, right? Because the first one is going to stand for this very first name stuff. It should be a string, so it's a string, and Owusu to will do the same thing. And we are expecting that when we call this function, when you how you give it Samuel and Owusu, it's going to give us return as this particular value, right? So now see, let me run. I want you to see something. So you see, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the only one that shows, right? This is the only one that shows, and it's as if this one did not work, but then it actually worked. What happened is that this particular first function, remember, it is this one, and then it is printing for us. Whenever you want to see something, you need to print it, right? But this particular function is returning something for us, right? So whatever it returns, we need to be ready to receive whatever the outcome of this into a variable. We know that this function will return a string, so we need to prepare a string. Let me call it string um, so a string um, result equals to, so we know that this particular function is going to return a string for us. So the variable where we want to put that result into should also be a string type. So this one is a string type because the function is going to give us something of string type, because see, the function is a string type, right? So whenever it operates, it's going to give us a string. And in variable, when we are keeping it in a variable, remember we need to keep it in a string variable. So the result is going to come, and we are going to keep it um inside this particular variable. So how do we then make sure that um we have, so the result is here, right? But let's print it. Print. Remember, we are not doing this print inside the function full name, right? Print is whenever you want to call. Here we want to print the full name return is, so let me call result. So this print doesn't, it is not within the function, it is outside, because this particular function is not printing anything, it's supposed to return something for us. So when we take that something, we can later manipulate it somewhere in the code, right? It may not really make sense with this guy, but then we'll see another example in the next one. So let me clear this and then run this thing for you. So you say that, you see the first line, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And the second one say the full name return is somewhere else. We see that it has put them together. It's run because now we have taken the result into, we are taking the outcome into a result variable, and we are printing the result variable. This result variable is returning whatever this function has done, and this is what the function does, right? So you define the function, then you go and use them in the main function whenever you want to. Let's use an example of numbers so that it will make more sense what functions are actually doing. So I'll keep those ones, and then we said what we want to do is that we want to first do a number a times, let's say number um 5 times 2, right? We want to do that 5 times 2, then we later we add 5 to it. The result will be 12, right? 5 times 2, that will be 10, plus 5, that will be 15. So the result is actually supposed to be 15. But we are going to do this instead. We are going to write two functions, right? The first function will take care of this one. The result of this, we are going to put another function to add it to this one. So let's create two functions. So the first function, let's call it multiplication, right? So multiply for us. So I will say when we multiply this by this, what are we going to return? 2 times 5 is going to be 10, and 10 is an integer, right? So the return type is going to be integer because this function is supposed to return. So multiply, then it's going to take two numbers, right? The first one is an integer, number one, let's say num1. The second one is also going to be an integer, num2, right? So it's returned 1 and 2 for us. And I open the variable. Now, in this variable, let's say, so let's say result, right? Int equals to int